G'day, mate. 40 here. So back in 2010, in February 21, 2010, I heard the UCLA psychiatrist, Dr. Stephen Malmer, a close friend with Dennis Prager, give a great analogy about life. He called it the spiral staircase of life. And he made the point, we work and we rework all the main challenges of development. Every time we do it, we can add to our happiness and we can reduce our unhappiness because we get another shot at working at a problem that has come up in the past and will come up again in the future, because no problem is ever solved 100%. So imagine you are climbing a spiral staircase in the tower, and at each vista there's a window, and you get to see the fields from a different window of this spiral staircase. So there are 4 basic developmental challenges: dependency, mastery, grandiosity, and feeling small in a big world. And you will face these challenges over and over again. You never get to graduate from these challenges. I've never forgotten this analogy. Right? We will experience these windows one way in childhood, another way in adolescence, another way in early adulthood, and another way in our geriatric phase. So when you're feeling dependent, remember when you had mastery. When you're feeling grandiose, remember when you were feeling small in a big world. It's a recipe for balance and for not feeling overwhelmed by any of these 4 stages, because each one of them modifies the other, and you never get to graduate from any of them. Like right now, I could have a seizure, I could have a stroke, I could have a heart attack, I could get a pounding at the door, someone could walk in, I could get a very important phone call, like anything could happen. And so I could go right now, I might be feeling mastery, but then I might get a devastating text and I might start feeling small in a big world. Some bad things might happen to me and I might get into a dependency cycle, or I start doing a really good show, I think, and then I'm feeling grandiosity, and then I get humiliated, so I go back to feeling dependency and feeling small in a big world. So we never get to graduate from any of these phases. I was just listening to the latest edition of a favorite podcast of mine, If Books Could Kill, and they're talking about the subtle art of not giving a F, right? That book. And they have a great little discussion here about what is a grifter.
So I'm going to ask you a question. I'll give you a minute.
Okay.
In your view, Michael, what is a grifter?
Oh, this is something that has become a more commonly used term. And like all commonly used terms, I think has taken on like a kind of muddy definition. But I think of it as someone who like knows that they are scamming you and are scamming you.
Yeah, I think that you're onto something there. I think there needs to be a bad faith element.
Yeah, so I heard the term grifter just thrown around a tremendous lot over, the last, say, 4 years. And I would like to think I virtually never use it as a put down because it's so slippery in its meaning. But yeah, I think there's an important bad faith element that people are deliberately conning people. So someone like Neil Strauss, right? He wrote the book The Game, and then he sold an information product based on that. And he could have just kept going on and on and on with various iterations of the game and made a ton more money. But he didn't want to do that because fundamentally, Neil Strauss, to the best of my knowledge about him, he's not a grifter, right? He could have made millions more dollars just reiterating the game, and he chose not to. He chose to go in very different directions. Dennis Prager, all right? He is not primarily motivated by money. He's not trying to operate in bad faith to con people. So I think the word grifter is overused.
And I think maybe a simple way to define it is someone who aggressively monetizes themselves in a way that undermines the authenticity of what they're doing, right? Ooh. So it seems like the true goal is the money rather than whatever they say it is. So Mark Manson was a blogger, like I said, right? Mm-hmm. He publishes a dating book, one of thousands on the market. Mm-hmm. He keeps blogging, writes a popular post, spins that into a book deal for this book. Mm-hmm. The book is a hit. And from there, he just sort of keeps it going in various ways. He puts out another book in 2019 called Everything is Fucked.
Okay.
He co-writes Will Smith's memoir in 2021.
Okay. That's actually the most respectable thing he's done so far. I feel like ghostwriting is a real art.
He sells monthly subscription content on his website where you get access to like articles and his ebooks, video courses. He posts videos on YouTube, and some of which is just him summarizing his own content, a lot of which is him summarizing his own content. Mm. He recently launched a podcast. Just this year, he put out The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck movie, which I watched 10 minutes of last night before I realized I hadn't watched this week's Survivor, and I was like, no.
You tried. You made it 10 minutes.
From what I could gather, it was him doing loose narration over like stock footage.
Okay.
I did not. I couldn't do it. I was like, no.
I've always wanted a sequel to Koyaanisqatsi that's mostly complaints about internet commenters and college sophomores.
You know, I said right up top that he rambles. Yeah. And the result is like a bunch of different ideas that just don't fully mesh. The latter section where he's talking about how like you need to be aware of your own mortality, it's just him sort of going on about death and its meaning and like what it means for how we should live our lives. And he says, the only way to be comfortable with death is to understand and see yourself as something bigger than yourself, to choose values that stretch beyond serving yourself, that are simple and immediate and controllable and tolerant of the chaotic world around you.
Yeah, that sounds like pretty good advice. All right. For me, the primary source of energy and motivation and strength and the best defense against inflation or bad times or earthquakes or unemployment is connection with other people, connection to a cause greater than yourself. So it looks like we will probably start getting hostages released tomorrow. So I have a strong in-group Jewish identity through my conversion to Orthodox Judaism. And so for me, all these posters of Israeli hostages taken to Gaza, these are sacred objects. And I understand for people who are not on board with Israel that these are competing victim stories, competing, hero systems that clash with one's own. So I recognize why many people would want to tear down such posters. I don't think they're terrible people for doing so, because it's essential to having a good life and an energetic life and a life that works and a life that is not miserable, to be connected to other people, to play a valuable role in other people's lives.
This is the basic root of all happiness. He sort of has this very atomized presentation, and then all of a sudden he like pivots into being like, well, you're part of something bigger. You need to have values that reflect that. But the bulk of the book is talking about taking responsibility and facing adversity. It's all very, very individualistic. There's nothing that really goes into any depth about building community, developing connections with other people. Right. So I really do feel like this is just a 30-something rambling. And like, so these sort of different tangents come out.
Okay, but a little later here, they make the point that self-help books meet a genuine need.
And they read it again a few years later and were like, what the fuck is this?
Yeah.
And I think
yeah, so often people read a self-help book and it just changes their life, or they meet a guru and it changes their life, and then they graduate.
People declare themselves experts, entrepreneurs, inventors, innovators, mavericks, and coaches without any real-life experience. Oh, it's one book.
One book, baby.
He's telling you the grip that he's doing.
How do you write that? How do you write that, dude? You're a finance dropout who started blogging, and you're talking shit about people without real life experience. This can't be fucking real.
Look, people are going to use curse words to make themselves seem edgy while actually repackaging reactionary, bog standard advice for you and selling it back to you.
Can you believe it? Can you believe that there are people doing that?
They're going to use an aggressively folksy tone with you.
One thing I read when I saw people chatting about this on like Reddit was someone saying that they read this book a few years ago and they thought it was so insightful and helped them a lot. And they read it again a few years later and were like, what the fuck is this?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of self-help is like that, where it's just getting people at a time when they need advice more than they need any specific advice and are using advice. It's like the feeling that you're receiving advice is itself therapeutic.
Right.
And so a lot of people, I think, are just at like a, crossroads in their life for whatever reason. They read a book like this and they come away with like a good impression because they just needed to be like talked to.
But this is also why I have like basically no contempt for people who read and enjoy these books, but bottomless contempt for the authors, because like they're fulfilling a real emotional need for people. And sometimes you just need a little pep talk.
Absolutely.
Like I think that's totally fine. And I think honestly, there's ways of writing these books that are like not that shitty. And like I get that they're in an individualistic frame and they never cover structural solutions, et cetera. And like the sort of limitations of the genre are kind of inherently baked into these books, and that's fine. But there's like a responsible way to do this. Tell people like you're not a piece of shit and like you can do stuff and like everything's going to turn out okay. I think fulfilling that emotional need is totally fine.
Yeah.
And even like in this book, it sounds like the actual core advice is like set a goal and like try to work through adversity. And it might be hard sometimes. And like that's like at the bottom of it, pretty reasonable advice. The problem is when you then package it with this weird worldview stuff and this weird like, wow, kids have like too much participation trophies and stuff that is basically misinformation or a way of looking at the world where it's like you're not just getting this pep talk, you're getting a pep talk that makes you think that it requires you to like step on other people, or that like
Yeah, some good critiques there of self-help books, recognizing that they meet a need, and at times we all feel dependent. At times we all feel small in a big world, and a guru, a live streamer, a self-help book, a good podcast can come along and meet a vital need. All right, let's get some John Mearsheimer's perspective, just released a few hours ago. Will Russia and China intervene in Gaza?
It's an opportunity for the Chinese to make diplomatic hay. The Chinese have been basically arguing that the United States is principally responsible for the disaster in Gaza because the United States assumed almost full responsibility for creating a two-state solution, and it failed. It failed miserably, and the end result is that we have this conflict. So the United States is to blame. And furthermore, if you look at how the United States is behaving since the conflict broke out, it's joined at the hip with the Israelis, and therefore it is guilty for what sorts of crimes the Israelis are creating in Gaza. So the United States is the bad guy in the Chinese story. And this is a story that resonates all around the global South and East.
Mearsheimer made a great point the other day that the number of civilian deaths in Gaza, however you calculate them, far outweighs, in a month, right, far outweighs the number of civilian deaths in the entire Russia invades Ukraine saga. So if that's true, and I believe it is, that's kind of breathtaking, because we've heard a lot about Russia massacring Ukrainian civilians and raping and pillaging and the massive loss of civilian life in Ukraine. But if it's true that there are more civilian dead in Gaza than in the entire Russia invades Ukraine story, that doesn't make Israel the bad guys and Russia the good guys. All right, Gaza is a different situation that's much more densely populated, but it does put the Western preoccupation with Russian violations of civil rights and human rights into, I think, much needed perspective, right? Any nation that is battling for its survival is not going to hesitate at attacking hospitals or churches or mosques or anyone that it thinks threatens its survival. Any living thing reacts very badly to anything else that threatens its survival. So for Russia, Ukraine becoming a de facto part of NATO effectively threatened Russia's sense of survival. For Israel, right, the Hamas attacks threatened its sense of survival so that Israel had to evacuate at least 100,000 of its citizens away from southern Israel and northern Israel. All right. So a large part of the reason that Israel doesn't abide by Western norms is the same reason that many Western nations don't abide by Western norms when they're in a battle for their own survival. Right? When the U.S. went to war in Iraq and Afghanistan, it was not fighting for its national survival, so it could be much more selective about its targets, and it could be much more careful about civilian casualties. When you're fighting for your survival, you don't hesitate nearly as much to go into churches or mosques or hospitals, and you do whatever you need to do if you believe you're engaged in a war for your own survival. So it's a very dangerous thing to back people into a corner so that they feel like they're fighting for their own survival.
Even in large chunks of the Western world, it's a very powerful story that the Chinese are telling. So diplomatically, it's manna from heaven for them. And for us, it's a disaster. I mean, the situation gets worse by the week for us.
Here's Matt Miller, Cut 5, Chris, who's a spokesperson for the State Department, waxing eloquently about China. I want your thoughts on this, but I invite you to the last phrase that he uses, which is almost laughable: the indispensability of the United States. But here he is.
We would welcome China playing a constructive role in the Middle East. The Secretary has made this clear personally in his conversations with Wang Yi. I called Wang Yi on our first trip to the Middle East and said if there's anything they can do to prevent the conflict from widening in terms of using the lines of communications that they have available to countries in the Middle East, we would welcome that. He followed up on that conversation with Wang Yi here and had a very productive conversation about it. To the larger question, though, I would say one of the things that we heard repeatedly from every party with which we engaged on our last trip was the indispensability of the United States.
I mean, that can't be serious that other countries have said to his boss, Secretary Blinken, that the United States is indispensable. That's a myth from George W. Bush to Joe Biden, and maybe even before George W.
I think Madeleine Albright is the person who made that phrase famous.
Oh, there you go.
And President Biden has recently repeated it. It's a phrase that enrages the Chinese and it enrages the Russians. And the last time I looked at a map, both of those countries are in Asia. And those are the countries that he's talking about the United States engaging with. And there are all sorts of other countries who do not like that rhetoric at all because it conveys American superiority. But just getting back to the question of how the United States thinks about China in the Middle East and China getting involved in the Gaza conflict, I think except for purposes of trying to prevent escalation, with which Mr. Miller referred to. If the Chinese could help us prevent this conflict in the Middle East from escalating, we would appreciate that for sure. But otherwise, we don't want the Chinese involved in the Middle East at all. We want it all for ourselves. The United States wants to be the dominant power diplomatically, economically, and militarily in that region of the world. And what's happening as a result of the Gaza conflict is it's becoming extremely difficult for us to maintain that position because we've created an opening for the Chinese and for the Russians. And unsurprisingly, they both have jumped into it.
Here's President Xi Jinping yesterday. He obviously did not get the message from Matthew Miller. The root cause of the Palestinian-Israeli situation is the fact of the right of the Palestinian people to statehood. Their right to existence and their right of return have long been ignored. I have emphasized on many occasions that the only viable way to break the cycle of Palestinian-Israeli conflict lies in the two-state solution, in the restoration of the legitimate national rights of Palestine and the establishment of an independent state of Palestine. There can be no sustainable peace and security in the Middle East without a just solution for Palestine. China calls for early convening of an international peace conference that is more authoritative, to build international consensus for peace and work toward an early solution to the question of Palestine that is comprehensive and sustainable. Wow.
Well, I mean, it's very clear that many people in the West, including every president since Jimmy Carter, have argued that it's imperative to get a two-state solution. They have been saying for a long time what Xi Jinping is now saying. I think most people that I know, most people I hang around with, believe that if there's any hope of putting an end to the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, there has to be a Palestinian state as well as a Jewish state. But the problem is that the United States has been largely unable to use the right word, it's been unable to coerce the Israelis, who are reluctant at best to accept a two-state solution, to move in that direction. Presidents have tried, but they've not been able to really exercise much coercive leverage against the Israelis, in large part because the Israel lobby, Israel's hardline supporters in the United States, have made it impossible for us to put pressure on Israel. And of course, the Israeli government now has no interest whatsoever in a two-state solution, and there's no way that Joe Biden is going to put any pressure on the Israelis to move toward a two-state solution, especially after what happened on October 7th. So in effect, there is no solution to this problem.
Do we care what President Xi Jinping thinks about the Israeli-Gaza conflagration?
We care because diplomatically he's saying all the right things. I think that most American policymakers understand at this point in time we're not going to have a two-state solution anytime soon, if ever. I think they understand that. But they also understand that from Xi Jinping's point of view and from Putin's point of view, it makes eminently good sense to advertise the fact that they are in favor of a two-state solution. They are in favor of helping the Palestinians. They are in favor of shutting this conflict down. And it's the Americans who are principally responsible, of course, along with the Israelis, for the failure to achieve that outcome, which is the right outcome for creating a peaceful situation between the Israelis and the Palestinians.
I don't want to spend too much time parsing his words, but what do you think he meant by an authoritative body? Is he talking about the Security Council of the United Nations or some other entity that would coerce the Netanyahu government to begin talks for the two-state solution?
Well, I would imagine he's talking about the Security Council, and I wouldn't be surprised, if at some point the Chinese and the Russians try to go to the Security Council and embarrass the United States by forcing it to veto some sort of resolution to move toward a two-state solution. But
there's definitely growing world pressure for some kind of two-state solution. And the U.S. is basically isolated in their strong support for Israel. Britain and Australia also support Israel, though not to the degree of the United States. But pretty much all the other nations of the world want some kind of two-state solution and would be looking for ways to impose it on Israel.
There's no real authoritative body that matters here. What matters here is that the Americans have to find themselves in a position where they can put pressure on Israel to move towards a two-state solution. But that's just not in the cards. And the end result, again, is that this one is just not going to be solved.
How diplomatically regressive, if that's the right word, is claiming that the Chinese diplomats referred to the United States as indispensable? I mean, that is farcical. No one would believe that.
No, the Chinese certainly don't believe that at all. The Chinese think that the United States is the principal threat to global stability. They have no use for American foreign policy. And the idea that we're the indispensable nation just rubs them the wrong way, because we're saying, in effect, that we are superior to them. Remember, the rest of Madeleine Albright's famous quote is, "We are the indispensable nation. We stand taller and we see further." If you think about those words, we stand taller, we see further. We're superior to everybody else. Even if you think that, you shouldn't say it.
Right.
Yeah, it's an absurd idea. Madeleine Albright is the one who said to 60 Minutes that even if U.S. sanctions on Iraq cost the lives of 500,000 Iraqi babies, that it's still a policy of sanctions worth pursuing.
Right, right. As you may know, someone spray painted mean, this is an act of vandalism and an act of graffiti, which I condemn, but the words are significant. On one of those pillars on the fence outside the White House, Genocide Joe. And Admiral Kirby responded in a rather animated way about this. I'd like you to listen to what he said, and then I'm going to play what a world leader said about this as well. Genocide Joe from Admiral Kirby.
I said this the other day. Again, people can say what they want on the sidewalk, and we respect that. That's what the First Amendment's about. But this word genocide is getting thrown around in a pretty inappropriate way by lots of different folks. What Hamas wants, make no mistake about it, is genocide. They want to wipe Israel off the map. They've said so publicly, more than one occasion. In fact, just recently. And they've said that they're not going to stop. What happened on the 7th of October is going to happen again and again and again. And what happened on the 7th of October? Murder, slaughter of innocent people in their homes or at a music festival. That's genocidal intentions. Yes, there are too many civilian casualties in Gaza. Yes, the numbers are too high. Yes.
Right, but why does Hamas have these genocidal intentions? All right, it's a response to a particularly pressing condition where people in Gaza feel like they're living in an open-air prison, and the Palestinians feel like they've been robbed of their land. They have some reason for thinking that. So it's not like it's just inherent to Palestinians or inherent to Muslims or inherent to Arabs to be genocidal. It's a reaction to a specific set of circumstances, that is the dominance of Israel over Palestinians.
Too many families are grieving, and yes, we continue to urge the Israelis to be as careful and cautious as possible. That's not going to stop, from the president right on down. But Israel is not trying to wipe the Palestinian people off the map. Israel's not trying to wipe Gaza off the map. Israel's trying to defend itself against a genocidal terrorist threat. So if we're going to start using that word, fine, let's use it appropriately.
Isn't Israel trying to wipe Gaza and the Palestinian people off the map? Not off the face of the earth, but off the map. He must mean the map of what they consider Greater Israel.
Well, as I think I said the last time I was on the show, it's very important to understand that when you look at the language that is being used by Israeli elites today, it is deeply disturbing. And Omer Bartov, who is an Israeli-born historian and a historian who studies the Holocaust, has said that Israel has genocidal intent in Gaza. You want to think about that. He is not saying that Israel is in the process of committing genocide, but based on the language and based on a lot of what is being seen.
So, yeah, there's a lot of discussion that Israel's response is not proportionate, and the basis is that Hamas killed approximately 1,200 Israelis October 7, and Israel has apparently killed over 10,000 Gazans. But in legal terms, proportionality does not refer to the type of weaponry used. It refers to intent. So Hamas had genocidal intent against Israel, and so Israel is fighting back against an enemy with genocidal intent. And so the legality regarding proportionality does not mean that if someone goes after you with a knife that you can't shoot them dead because they've only got a knife, so how dare you use a gun? That's illegal. No, if someone's trying to kill you, right, you're legally authorized to kill them. And it doesn't matter if you use a gun or you use a stone or your bare hands.
Seen on the battlefield inside of Gaza. He concludes that Israel has genocidal intent. And he, along with a large number of other scholars of the Holocaust, many of whom are Jewish or Israeli, have written a letter to the New York Review of Books that basically makes the same argument. So you want to understand that this is a potentially dangerous situation.
So for years, I wondered why John Mearsheimer seemed to only invoke human rights and violations of human rights when it comes to Israel's treatment of Palestinians. He certainly wasn't invoking, Russia's failure to respect human rights in its invasion of Ukraine. In his general perspectives on great power politics, he doesn't pay much attention to human rights. So why this selective focus on human rights when it comes to Israel's treatment of Palestinians? And then when he made the point that Israel in a month has killed more civilians in Gaza than Russia has killed civilians in its Ukraine war in 18 months. Like, okay, that's a very sobering perspective that I had not thought of.
Because the Israelis give evidence that they may spin out of control here. So again, my argument is not that the Israelis are committing genocide at this point in time. I don't think that's true. I think that there's no question that they've engaged in mass murder, but not genocide. And nevertheless, as Bartov says, there is genocidal intent here.
And so far, Israel's failed to produce evidence that this Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza was a major command center for Hamas. So if the best evidence that they can find is like one mine shaft and some weapons in an MRI facility, all right, that looks incredibly bad for Israel. So far, Israel has not substantiated its claims that the Al-Shifa hospital was a major command center. And so waging war on a hospital, unless it's a major command center for the enemy, just looks absolutely terrible for Israel's cause.
President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa on this very topic yesterday.
The collective punishment of Palestinian civilians through the unlawful use of force by Israel is a war crime. The deliberate denial of medicine, fuel, food, and water to the residents of Gaza is tantamount to genocide.
Does he make the argument that is being made in the region, in the Middle East, by the non-Israelis?
Well, the word genocide is thrown around quite loosely these days by people. I think that he's right that Israel is committing war crimes. And I think that starving the population, the civilian population in Gaza, is clearly a war crime. I think indiscriminately bombing the population in Gaza is a war crime. There's no doubt about that. But I would not describe either one of those acts as genocide. I don't mean to split hairs here, but you have to have a clear definition of what genocide is. And for me, genocide is a policy that is designed to eliminate an entire population, to effectively kill an entire population.
Well, there are members of Prime Minister Netanyahu's cabinet who have called for that. I've never heard him call for it.
There's no question about that, that there are Israeli elites who have called for that. And that's why, again, Omer Bartov and others.
So a lot of Jews, in reaction to the October 7 slaughter, did essentially call for the destruction of Gaza, not just the destruction of Hamas, the destruction of Gaza. And so this gets back to something that Thomas Sowell talks about, first stage thinking. So you have a goal, you want to push forward your goal, but whenever you act, all right, it always engenders reactions. So this is from Tom Sowell's book, 2010, Applied Economics, Thinking Beyond Stage 1. And so he says, political thinking tends to conceive of policies, institutions, or programs in terms of their hoped-for results, such as drug prevention or gun control or environmental protection or public interest or various, gender equality goals. But for purposes of economic analyses, what matters is not what goals are being sought, but what incentives and constraints are being created in the pursuit of those goals. So when many members of Netanyahu's cabinet essentially called for genocide against Gazans, and when many other Jews have called for the same thing in public on social media, that engenders a backlash, which is really bad for Jews and really bad for Israel. So it's not that various policies may fail to achieve their purposes, but we need to know the characteristics of the processes set in motion. So when you act, when you set forward, say, rhetoric about committing genocide against Gazans, all right, you then create incentives and constraints and reaction, right? And so instead of judging what people say or do by their goals, we need to be more wise, more discreet, and think about the unintended consequences of their rhetoric and their policies and their programs. So think beyond stage 1 and then look to the consequences. So remember that cafe, pro-Israel cafe in New York, supposedly causing a staff result. Well, all these workers really didn't want to be put in the middle of a Middle East conflict, right? And they didn't want to be buttonholed by customers about the Middle East. They simply wanted to do their job in as easy and pleasant way as possible. And being, upping the emotional intensity around them was probably not a pleasant perspective. And so when many Jews react in a very visceral, strong in-group identity, pro-Israel rhetoric, that will often encourage those around them who've never even thought in these terms, but they suddenly start saying in reaction to what they perceive as, rabid or genocidal pro-Israel sentiments, they start saying free Palestine. So you may have a goal, you may have a rhetoric, your team has goals, but as it works towards them, right, if you are engendering more opposition than support with your rhetoric, you're losing. And I saw this with Donald Trump and his supporters. They engendered far more effective opposition than they were able to engender support. This is Richard Spencer talking about how he thinks Donald Trump is going to be the next
out of
president.
office people who don't like the fact that he failed on student loans or whatever,
Joe Biden,
but they're going to vote for him anyway. There are a lot of people you could say, oh, Trump is such a specter of evil that they're going to vote for him. Some of those lines are fair, but this is going to be a close election, at least on the electoral college level. He is quite old. He is increasingly out of touch. And my sense is that he is going to lose. Replacing Joe is possible at this stage, but I don't think the DNC is really willing to replace Joe's policies. I mean, you could argue that, I mean, look, I think Kamala Harris would be a much worse candidate, but you could argue that maybe Gavin Newsom, you know, goddamn, he's handsome. You know, he would be a better candidate. Maybe, but even Gavin Newsom, I don't think could really turn this train around. So that is, I'm basically making an argument of demoralization of your own base of support and a get out the vote issue that leads to a remarkable re-election, I guess you could say, of Donald Trump, similar to what we saw in 2016. Although I think this one's going to be worse. Hillary Clinton was out of office, even out of the Obama administration, and she was, you know, when you've been sitting on the sidelines for a little bit, there's a little bit of potentiality. You know, maybe she could have changed. Maybe she would do this differently, etc. Joe's in office, and he is overseeing a catastrophe in the eyes of the world, and I think he's going to lose. The other thing about Trump is that there is a lot of fuck you energy with Trump. I see a lot of the fuck you energy from 2016. What do I mean by that? I am referring to basically Michael Moore's famous monologue of 2016, which is that, you know, there's one day a year when everyone is equal, when the billionaire.
Okay, let me get the rest of this Richard Spencer discussion.
When the billionaire and the homeless person have the same amount of power, and that is election day. And, you know, I don't know what I think about Donald Trump. I might not even like Donald Trump, but I know that the guy who fired me hates Donald Trump. I know that the media personality who demeaned me hates Donald Trump. And so I'm going to complete the biggest fuck you ever by electing Donald Trump. I see a lot of that energy. Donald Trump as a phenomenon cannot be defeated through the legal system. He cannot be defeated through civil trials. He cannot even be defeated through a criminal trial. He cannot be defeated through a criminal conviction, because it is a political, ideological, and in some crazy way, religious movement. And I'm not, to be honest, really a part of that ideological or religious movement. But I recognize that it exists and that it is real. They're going to try to nickel and dime him, in effect, death by 1,000 cuts. It's not going to work. The ideological fervor of fuck you will overwhelm a bunch of lawyers, however justified they are in prosecuting him. And not in all of those cases. Some of those cases I could not care less about. But some of them actually, they seem quite justified, in fact. But it just doesn't matter. You're using legal technicalities, in effect, a process, and you're not going after him mano a mano, defeating him definitively politically. And being that they're not willing to do that, Donald Trump can win, and he can win on the basis of a kind of...
Yeah, it's stunning to think that right now Donald Trump is the favorite to win the 2024 election, and there's the same FU energy that's just exploded in Holland. All right, Geert Wilders was the big winner, the anti-Islam right-wing politician.
Raised Dionysian energy combined with a demoralized, depressed voting base on the left.
Okay, thank you. That was Richard Spencer.
And the billionaire and the homeless person.
Stop it. Okay, and then we had this right-wing populist reaction in Argentina, Javier Milei, and in Holland, So let me go to the Duran here, get their perspective.
Is talking about Javier Milei. He could be a force for change in Argentina, perhaps positive change. He could also be a big bust. He's very eccentric. He's very eccentric, very colorful. He says a lot of stuff. He does a lot of stuff. Does a lot of bizarre stuff. But the Argentinian people, they voted for him to be the president, and he says he's going to enact some very drastic, controversial, risky policies. For example, moving Argentina away from the peso towards the USD, and perhaps even moving Argentina away or out of BRICS, for which they just entered BRICS. So we're going to need some time to see how he governs. But what are your thoughts on the election in Argentina?
I mean, in some ways, it is unsurprising. I mean, Argentina has had a very troubled economic history for as long as I can remember. And I'm not an expert on Argentina and its economic system. I don't know why these problems exist in what logically should be a rich country with abundant raw materials, an educated workforce, and an industrial base, but they do. And no government up to now seems to have been able to get on top of them. I mean, we've had brief moments when things did appear to be getting better, for example.
So I know a lot of people from South America, from mainly Brazil and Argentina, and they make the point, if you get robbed at gunpoint in Brazil, you very well should fear for your life, all right? If there's an invasion of your home or of your store, all right, you have very real reasons to be concerned for your life. Argentina is a much more European country, so if you get held up, all right, in Argentina, you're much less likely to be physically hurt than in Brazil. So Argentina, for all its problems, still has a per capita GNP about 3 times that of Brazil.
Under Ferdinand Kirchner, not Christina Kirchner, this is the husband, not the wife, but when he was president, he did seem to be able to bring things sort of under control. But these periods of stability tend to be relatively short. Things go wrong. At the moment, Argentina has 120% inflation. The peso has been...
Bernard makes a great comment in the chat. Muslims call for the genocide of Jews all the time, not exactly getting much reaction. And that's because people have very low moral expectations for Muslims, for Arabs, and for blacks. And so people have much higher moral expectations for Jews and for whites. So that's why the United Nations condemns Israel so often, is that Jews are held to a much higher standard in world opinion than Arabs, than blacks, than Muslims. Right, this is from the podcast, The Duran.
Being devaluing and losing its value, and both internally and externally, things have not been well in Argentina. And it is not surprising, given all this history that we've seen and given the current realities, that people have decided, well, look, I mean, Milei may be a bit eccentric and a bit strange, and perhaps some of his proposals are way out of the box, but they could hardly be worse than they are now. He's offering us some way forward, some way that's different to the problems we've long since had, and let's go for him. And I'm not going to predict the outcome of this. I suspect, this is my guess, in the short term, some of the things that he's going to do might actually stabilize the situation. I mean, replacing the peso with the USD might, for a while, bring inflation under control, might cause parts of the economy to revive. I suspect that in time, they would be unsustainable and that they could probably cause all kinds of other tensions. But, let's wait and see, as you said, and see what comes. More importantly, and it's not perhaps more importantly for the Argentinian people, but perhaps in terms of geopolitical terms, is what is he going to do about Argentina's recent alignments. And here I'm going to say straightforwardly, I'm absolutely sure that he is not going to take Argentina into the BRICS. Argentina isn't yet in the BRICS, but at the summit in Johannesburg, it received an invitation to join the BRICS. The previous government was intending to join the BRICS in January. It is universally known that it was President Lula da Silva of Brazil who very, very strongly lobbied the other BRICS states to admit Argentina. Some of the other BRICS states, notably China, I understand, and India, were skeptical.
Okay, so the election of these populists like Javier Milei, quite different from populism in America. But they are both movements of the right. All right, you've got the same gonzo energy that you have with Trump. You've got the criticism of corrupt elites. You've got rants against the left. You got the same support from social and religious conservatives. At the same time, this Argentine politician is much more of a doctrinaire libertarian than a Trump-style mercantilist or populist. He's a more extreme version of Barry Goldwater and Paul Ryan rather than a defender of entitlement spending and tariffs. So what do these populist movements have in common? I'm looking at Ross Douthat's column here in the New York Times. So what does it really mean to be on the right? So generally speaking, to be on the right means that you expect that traditional ways of organizing people and communities and things like marriage, all right, the traditional ways are time-tested and more likely to be effective than new ways, such as same-sex marriage. Right? People on the right are more supportive of harsh punishment for criminals. So the United States could slash its murder rate simply by keeping murderers in prison for longer, right? And for punishing them longer and punishing more of them. So harsher punishment for criminals, right, is a characteristic of a right-wing approach to life. Restricting immigration and concern about strangers, right, much more likely on the right than on the left. Right, so another way of understanding right-left differences is that left-wing politics is more nurturing and kind of like a nurturing mother, and right-wing politics is more rules-bound and hierarchical and authoritative, like dad. So it's kind of a difference between ethnocentric hawks, conservatives, and empathic doves, liberals, between dad morality and mum morality, between those who are relatively open to outgroups and those who have many more negative feelings about outgroups, which are people on the right. So conservatives use strict father language. Liberals tend to use, nurturing mother language. And so ethnocentrics do not give a fig for individual rights. So libertarianism is not inherently right-wing. You can have left-wing and right-wing libertarian. So any connection between the right wing and the free market is a relatively recent development, right? The deep forces that shape political predispositions, right, do not necessarily act directly on controversies over the role of government in society. But they're more deep-seated biological reactions to the role of hierarchy, how concerned we should be about contamination, about outgroups. And I'm working here from a terrific book from 2013, Predisposed Liberals, Conservatives, and the Biology of Political Differences. Let me get a little bit more here from the Duran.
Presume is good advice about
a horrible war is going to unfold in Israel and in Gaza. But as your analysis, as you gave your analysis about what's going to happen in the UN, so it is playing out pretty much exactly as we discussed in those early videos in October with regards to this conflict. So where are we now with everything taking place in the United Nations Security Council?
Well, exactly. We've now had the first actual resolution passed by the UN Security Council.
So I just recently discovered Alexander Mercouris and the Duran podcast, and I give him credit for his ability to understand diplomatic pronouncements and what's going on with the United Nations and world opinion and elite opinion. He seems to be very widely read.
And, we had the lead up to this. We've had Russian draft resolutions, which were rejected, Brazilian draft resolutions, which were rejected, American draft resolutions, which were rejected. We've had a vote in the General Assembly, which called for a ceasefire, basically. And now we've had the first resolution, actual resolution, pass through the Security Council. And you can see the trend. The Security Council, the UN Security Council, is edging towards the eventual ceasefire, binding ceasefire resolution. And they didn't quite call that for that in that latest resolution that we've just seen, because for the moment, the United States still doesn't want to use the word ceasefire. It still doesn't want to have a complete ceasefire, still providing diplomatic cover for what the Israelis are doing in Gaza, but they are gradually retreating. And so we've had the resolution, and it was proposed by Malta, which is an interesting country to propose a resolution like this. There's clearly been an awful lot of backroom negotiation and discussion. Malta is a Mediterranean country. It's an island country. It's part of the European Union, but it is also very friendly to the Arab states. It's got close historic links with many of the Arab countries. So it came up with this resolution, which calls for prolonged humanitarian pauses. It specifically says that the blockades, the energy and water and food should be allowed back into Gaza. It talks about the importance of adhering to international humanitarian law. It does also call on Hamas to release its hostages, which of course it's inevitably going to do, and which is in fact the international consensus within the international community. But it's gradually taking us ever closer to the eventual end point, which is a resolution either from the Security Council or from the General Assembly, which straightforwardly calls for a ceasefire and does so in binding terms. So Israel has rejected this resolution. They said that this isn't connected to reality, but we are
So when I talk to my, more Zionist Jewish friends, they basically have the attitude, F world opinion, we don't care about world opinion. But world opinion matters, right? When world opinion congeals against you, right, it makes life very difficult. Just look at South Africa, right? In large part, it was South Africa that, went up against world opinion with its apartheid policies, and finally South Africans just got tired of fighting world opinion.
Gradually working that way. And there was an article in the Financial Times which had quoted the Israeli Foreign Minister Eli Cohen saying that, in his opinion, a ceasefire, some kind of end to hostilities, is likely to come sometime around the end of November, beginning of December, sometime around then.
Okay, so how does the U.S. play this? Because I was listening to your video yesterday, and I guess if the U.S. is smart about things, they'll get Israel to a ceasefire before this resolution, this binding resolution, is passed. Because if a binding resolution is passed, which calls for a ceasefire, I imagine Israel has to honor that resolution. I imagine they have to honor that resolution. I'm not sure. And
no, they don't have to honor the resolution. So the United Nations doesn't have any armed forces of substance behind it. The United Nations can only, gather armed forces if various powerful countries get together and decide to use the UN to advance their agendas, and then propose armed forces that will go do specific tasks. So you may well get international armed forces patrolling Gaza. South Africa has talked about having a willingness to send armed forces there.
It's going to look terrible, not only for Israel, it's going to look really bad for the United States as well. It's going to really show the U.S.'s isolation on this matter. So they're better served, the Biden White House is better served by getting Netanyahu to a ceasefire before the UN gets Netanyahu to a ceasefire.
Absolutely correct. Now, can I just say the United States does have one thing going for it, in my opinion, in all of this, which is I've been tracking very carefully the debates in the United Nations. And I have to say that the American ambassador strikes me as a capable person. So the ambassador must be giving what I presume is good advice about the trend, the movement in world opinion, the shift in world opinion back to the State Department and to the White House. Now, one doesn't know whether this advice is being followed, but I have felt overall that as American diplomats go, this is a good one. So they had that going for them. But let's go to the voting on this particular resolution, because it was extremely interesting and it exposes exactly the point you're making about how the United States risks being isolated and risks being confronted by a binding resolution, if not from the Security Council, perhaps from the General Assembly, which it doesn't really want, that is, in other words, imposed upon it. So the resolution, the draft resolution, which only calls for extended humanitarian pauses, was proposed by Malta. The Russians, who have been driving the demands in the Security Council for an outright ceasefire, then proposed an amendment. Now, let us be very clear. This is something that will have been debated by the Russians, with the Maltese, with all of the others. So this would have been prearranged. So the Russians propose an amendment to the resolution. The amendment is based on the vote that was recently made by the General Assembly, which called for a ceasefire, essentially called for a ceasefire. So this is a proposed amendment strengthening this Maltese draft by converting the extended humanitarian pause into an effective ceasefire. 5 countries support Russia, all the BRICS states: Brazil, China, the UAE, who are on the Security Council. The UAE isn't yet a BRICS state, but it will be.
So Alexander Mercouris does a daily podcast, usually over an hour in length. I just started listening to it because John Mearsheimer said that he listens to it every day. So I got up at 4:38 this morning, and for the first time, I took Adderall. So this is Luke Ford on Adderall, and I feel great. I had my cold shower, came in about 5 a.m., took my Adderall. So we're going on, 4 hours now. So I think Adderall's, half-life is probably 2 or 3 hours. So it's about half as intense 2 or 3 hours later. So I'm now 4 hours into my first Adderall experience, and I feel great. So I've been thinking about getting an ADHD diagnosis for at least 15 years, ever since I encountered all these therapists who specialize in sex addiction say that all of their sex addict clients had ADHD. And I thought, whoa, this might include me. And then I started reading books on ADHD. And then I've got family members with ADHD whose lives were completely transformed by taking ADHD medication. And so I finally broke down, got diagnosed with it about 3 weeks ago, finally received my medication in the mail. And it's a new era. This is 40 on 0 modafinil today. All right. I'm just purely powered by Adderall. So I've had so many friends warn me against it. So I think these are friends with possibly some addictive or abusive tendencies with regard to medication. I would assume that for people who use Adderall as prescribed, that for most of them it's a helpful thing, but absolutely anything can be abused, and Adderall does have addictive tendencies. Modafinil does not have addictive tendencies. Adderall has street value. Modafinil doesn't really have much street value. Adderall is highly addictive. Modafinil is not addictive. I hear that Adderall, there's a bit of a crash when it wears out. And so there's an inherent biological craving that's created for more and more of it. You don't have that with modafinil. Adderall is a stimulant. It's basically amphetamine. Modafinil is not a stimulant. It's often described as a stimulant, but it is not a stimulant. It just makes you more alert and more awake. Kenneth Brown suggests that your sex addiction can be looked at through the lens of the tripartite class structure. It is nothing like the buzz from drinking coffee, right? That's a buzz. Adderall, it's much smoother and it makes you want to organize things. So on Adderall, I took my first Adderall. I wrote 3 blog posts on lukeford.net, and I edited 2 other blog posts. Then I, put down some notes for today's show. I cleaned my bathtub. So it makes you want to be productive. Modafinil is similar. Modafinil also helps with ADHD, though it's not a top line, first line of attack medication for ADHD, but it certainly helps. Adderall is a stronger effect than modafinil. Modafinil is much milder. Coffee is buzzy. Adderall just makes your mind feel strong, and modafinil makes your mind feel furious. Nicotine. All right, nicotine. I've had some nicotine gum. It seems to heighten the power of your thinking. So it's not a buzz like coffee. It just seems to make you a little smarter. So yeah, I can rotate different meds and modalities, keep from developing a habit or an addiction or building up to toxicity. The chat says, get a TENS unit. I got a TENS unit, vagus nerve stimulator, a heat and cold therapy, mushrooms, etc. Okay. So let's get a little bit more here from the Duran.
Will be very soon. They support the Russians. So does Madagascar. That's 5 out of the states. One state votes against the Russian amendment, and that is the United States. All the others, all of them, abstain, including Malta, which has actually proposed this resolution. They don't fundamentally object, in other words, to the Russian amendment, proposed amendment to their own resolution. Rather than vote against it, as you would expect that they would do, they actually abstain. Even France, Britain, Switzerland are too embarrassed to vote against, too embarrassed by the situation, to actually positively vote against the Russian amendment. So then the resolution itself, without the Russian amendment, goes to the vote. Everybody supports it except 3 countries. These are the United States and Britain, which both abstain. And of course, the Russians, who are simply keeping their powder dry.
And Alexander Mercouris here from the Duran podcast, he says the Biden administration is the most inept foreign policy team, has the most inept foreign policy of any American administration since prior to World War II. So we are risking war, the United States getting involved in wider war in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and over Taiwan. The Biden administration has plans to send $10 billion worth of arms to Taiwan, which China is not going to have a very positive reaction. 40, thoughts on the unhinged Jewish boomer telling an Arab immigrant that he will call Egyptian security so they can torture his family. I think this is an example of Ashkenazi, shock speech, right? Ashkenazi Jews are very rarely physically violent, but they are frequently verbally violent. And I'm sure that that Jewish boomer regrets what he said. Give me the link. I want to play that. Right. Let me find more here from the Duran talking about what a disaster Biden's foreign policy is.
Newsom went there, and he clearly was working with the administration as well. And they moved heaven and earth to get Xi Jinping to come to San Francisco to attend the summit. And the Chinese played very, very hard to get. They kept us all guessing right up until almost the last moment about whether or not Xi Jinping was actually going to come. And what we also know, and this is an important thing to say, is that the Chinese, in terms of the optics, drove a ferociously hard bargain. They insisted that the streets of San Francisco must be completely cleaned out, and they were. They basically said no protesters anywhere near Xi Jinping or his motorcade, and there were none. We had all these people from the Chinese community in San Francisco, which is a big community, as we all know, coming out, waving the Chinese flags, so that it looks as if Xi Jinping has this enormous support in...
Yeah, so I regard what ex-Obama official says to the halal cart guy. I think it's reprehensible.
Really? Okay, go, yeah.
And to the Egyptian, the Mukhabarat wants your picture.
Okay, yalla, go.
Yeah? You know the Mukhabarat?
The
Mukhabarat.
No, I don't know.
You don't know?
I don't speak English.
No?
Yeah, go, yalla.
Mukhabarat in Egypt will get your parents.
Go.
Does your father like his fingernails? They'll
man.
take them out one by one.
يلا روح منين يلا go.
Why should I go? Why should I go? Tell me why I should go. I'm standing here. I'm an American. I have it's a free country. It's not like Egypt.
Yeah, Ashkenazi Jews can be violent. Anyone can be violent. But in the West and in Israel, they have very low violent crime rates. Right? Going to war for the survival of your nation is a very different modality than just committing random street murders. Yeah, this guy is reprehensible. Like, don't harass people, and don't threaten to torture.
Did you rape your daughter like Muhammad did?
Oh my God!
Did you rape your daughter like Muhammad?
I don't speak English.
You only speak English?
No English. No.
You don't speak English?
Yes.
All right. Well, that just shows how ignorant you are. Because Muhammad was a rapist. It says in the Hadith, in your holy book.
Oh Muhammad.
What?
Oh Muhammad.
Muhammad, your prophet. You know who he is.
My prophet?
Yeah. He was a rapist. He raped Aisha. Does it say that in the Hadith or not? You know that?
I don't speak English.
What?
No English.
You don't speak English? What do you speak? What do you speak? You speak Arabic? The language of the Quran? The Holy Quran? That some people use as a toilet? What do you think of that? People who use the Quran as a toilet? Does it bother you? Does it bother you? Tell me the truth.
I don't speak English.
You don't speak English?
So apparently this guy is 84 years old. He looks pretty good for 84, but it's also not uncommon as people, get older that they become, less constrained.
English? That's too bad. That's why you're selling food in a food cart, because you're ignorant. But you should learn English. It'll help you.
Of course,
when they report you back to Egypt, and the Mukhabarat wants to interview you for being
because I'm more.
Look, we all have a part of ourselves that regard those who are different as subhuman, and we normally completely suppress that. And when we do express that normal human tendency to regard those who are different as subhuman, right? Usually it's not caught on camera and then publicized for the world to see. We have all said vile things similar to this guy, right? He's 84 years of age, and he fell prey to that very human instinct of just, wanting to mock and belittle someone who's, different, who he sees as representing Hamas. And I think what he did was absolutely disgusting, but I also recognize that's just a universal human tendency, is to regard anyone who's not us as less than human.
The United States, amongst people of Chinese origin at the least, the Chinese insisted that the meeting take place before the APEC summit itself, so as to make it absolutely clear that Xi Jinping is not just one amongst many Asia-Pacific leaders that the President of the United States is meeting. He is far and away the most important. They insisted, apparently, that the venue be away from San Francisco itself, so that was why it happened at the Philadelphia estate. I mean, they were put in complete control of all of the optics. So people in China, they see all of this.
Yeah, so this is Stuart Seldowitz, and he's 84, all right, just unhinged. Also, New Yorkers tend to be much more verbally aggressive than most other Americans. Here he is going after
You're
Russia.
not answering my question. How does it feel to be a criminal? You're not answering my question.
Really? Okay, go, yeah.
And to the Egyptian, the Mukhabarat wants your picture.
Okay.
It says in the
awful behavior, but also all too common. But usually people are not caught on camera. But we all have this tendency just to dismiss the humanity of those who are different.
They see, Xi Jinping's motorcade with all the red flags there. They have this meeting, and then, of course, directly after the meeting with Biden, in what I think is an astonishing demonstration of power, and I think this is partly what the Chinese were up to. You had this meeting at the Regency Hyatt in San Francisco with all the business leaders there, Cook of Apple, Elon Musk. They're all.
Okay, let me look here at the chat. Luke Cross says, how many people who think like him are in the U.S. government have influence over U.S. foreign policy? He's retired so he can be honest about his real beliefs. These are not necessarily his real beliefs, right? They are a product of a particular time and circumstance, the aftermath of the October 7 Hamas attack on Israel. Also, he's gotten much older, and many old people in their 70s and 80s, they just start flying off the handle and saying things that they would not have said when they were younger. So what people say when they are angry is not necessarily reflective of their true beliefs. Everything that we say and do is a product of a particular time and particular circumstances and a particular situation, right? There's no true self. Like, everything we are is shaped by the situation that we are operating in, right? This is back to the Duran podcast on the President Joe Biden summit with President Xi from China, and Joe Biden's press conference disaster following that summit.
There, and they make this great, they give Xi Jinping a standing ovation. And it's become clear to the people across the world, in China, in the United States, that Xi Jinping and the US-China relationship has the support of the American business community. So, I mean, it is, you can see how the Chinese controlled the summit. And they did it because the Americans pleaded with them for it. So why did the Americans do all of this? Why did they engage in all of these concessions? I think there's a very simple answer. Partly, it is what you said. They don't want another crisis at this time. Project Ukraine has gone hideously, disastrously wrong. They have another crisis in the Middle East. Biden's poll numbers are in a critical state. So they don't want another crisis, especially in the year, next year, which is the year of the coming presidential election in November. So they don't want that to happen. And at the same time, and I think equally important, within the United States, it's clear that there is still a big China lobby, people who want to maintain good business relations with China. And they are important people. They are people who are important Democratic Party donors. They are people who the United States government cannot simply ignore. The Democratic Party.
There are lots of people I know who've had their catalytic converter stolen 4 times this year. Right? All sorts of people I know in Los Angeles have had their catalytic converter stolen over and over and over again. Oy, I mean, what a nightmare. And Californians brought this on themselves. Los Angelinos brought this on themselves by selecting DAs who don't punish such crimes. And Californians passed a referendum saying that if you steal less than $950, it only counts as a misdemeanor, not a felony. So we get to choose how much crime we have, all right, in large part by how severely we punish crime and how much of a priority we put on catching and convicting criminals.
Cannot simply ignore. And of course, Janet Yellen, who is the Treasury Secretary, she has her other concern, which is that the United States is now running massive budget deficits. It needs to raise funds to keep the government going, especially with all the problems in Congress. So she needs to try to persuade the Chinese to resume buying Treasury bonds. And note that when Xi Jinping arrives at the airport, who is there to greet him? It's Janet Yellen.
Yeah, they need money.
They need money.
Okay, here's another clip from Stuart Seldowitz, who is President Obama's former National Security Council advisor. And Here he is talking about the Arabs.
We used to joke when I was in the State Department that, the Middle East was 500, is quickly entering the 14th century. So,
okay.
We used to joke when I was in the State Department.
Okay, that's not, I think that's, I don't think that's a cheap put down. Right? The Arab Islamic world is incredibly primitive. And that's just the state of the Arab Islamic world. It's not inherent to Islam. It's not inherent to Arabs. That is the state now of the Arab Islamic world. Right? And it can change when circumstances change. But that is the state now.
The government needs money. The Biden campaign needs money. They need money, and they need to make sure that they don't end up in another conflict. I was going to say quagmire. Conflict, but maybe quagmire is the correct word. Yeah, but they control the ability to not end up in another conflict. I mean, it's in their control. And I think Xi Jinping actually said as much in his statement. He said, "We have two choices. We can either learn to live together, or this can be a zero-sum game, and you guys."
Right. Here's another clip of Stuart Seldowitz talking about if we killed 4,000 Palestinians, it was not enough.
If we killed 4,000 Palestinian kids, you know what? It wasn't enough. It wasn't enough.
Go.
That's horrible.
You know what? If we killed 4,000 Palestinian kids, you know what? It wasn't enough. It wasn't enough.
Go.
So, former Barack Obama foreign policy advisor. There he is. So one of the best moral guide that I know is not thinking, what would God think? Because for most people, God is not as viscerally real to them as other people's opinion. But ask, what would your neighbors think? What would your friends think? What would your parents think? All right, what would your enemies think about what you're about to say and do? What would your employer think? Like when you're live streaming, keep in mind, what would your parents think? What would your friends think? What would your neighbors think? What would your enemies think? What would an attorney think? And think about what would be the consequences to your life if the words and actions that you're engaged in were to be publicly broadcast, say, on the front page of the New York Times. The single best moral guide, single best guide to decent and effective behavior of which I'm aware. Just picture your words and your actions on the front page of the New York Times.
Continue escalating, and so be it. I mean, it doesn't get more clear than that.
Absolutely. And can I come back and make the previous point that the Chinese, through controlling all the optics of the summit, through getting all the business people to give Xi Jinping a standing ovation, they gave a tremendous demonstration of their own power. And I think, in terms of competition, what they're basically saying, look, we don't want to supplant you. We don't want to replace you as the world's leading country. This is not what we are about. The planet is big enough for both of us. But if you come after us, if you start turning ugly against us, we are supremely powerful and we can deal with it. And that was, that is the underlying message that the Chinese conveyed over the course of.
And the chat says this guy, Stuart, he believes 50 Arabs are worth one Jewish life. Well, that's pretty normal if you have a strong in-group identity, right? To think that that one member of your group is worth more than 500 members of the enemy or some hated outgroup. I think that's just a normal human reaction.
To the summit. Now, you're absolutely right. The administration has the power to control this thing. But this is where we come back to the problem at the core of the administration. And I have to say this straight.
Yeah, so having loathing and contempt for a hated outgroup, even though that's normal, natural, and even to some degree healthy, particularly if you keep it, say, no more than a 3 or 4 in intensity, but you should not publicly broadcast it. Right? That's a really bad idea. All right? You should have a safe space within your in-group where you can give vent to your most bigoted thoughts and feelings, but don't go venting them on strangers. Right? Think about what they would look like if they were published on the front page of the New York Times.
Forwardly, the core of the problem is the president. Even if there were some people like, say, Yellen in the administration who wanted to pursue a genuine détente and rapprochement with the Chinese, it is impossible. It is structurally impossible because we saw the president. As I said, I have serious doubts about whether he's really capable of conducting a summit meeting with Xi Jinping, and then he gave this utter car crash of a press conference afterwards. And I mean, it was embarrassing. You could see Blinken's face through it. I mean, many people.
And Luke Croft says in the chat, yeah, Stuart should have been smart and quietly advanced Jewish interests without the outward displays of hatred. We should all be smart, right? If you loathe gay marriage, it's not going to advance your cause or your life, right? If you publicly advocating how much you loathe gay marriage. If you loathe the idea of a Palestinian state, all right, it's not going to advance your life or your cause. Go around saying those things out loud. You have to understand the consequences, what goes beyond stage one, right? What will your words and actions elicit from other people, right? I think Jesus said something wise, to be as wise as servant, be as wise as serpents and appear as harmless as doves. Right? That's a pretty good approach to life. Right, back to the Duran here, the podcast analysis, Alexander Mercouris talking about Joe Biden's disastrous press conference after his summit meeting with China's dictator.
I've commented about this. The president was barely in control of what he was saying. He's clearly being managed now. I mean, the overall impression was that he really has no control over himself, let alone over the United States government. And I mean, he blurts out state secrets in a press conference. I mean, imagine if Donald Trump had done something like that, what people would have been saying. But, the president does that, apologizes to his own Secretary of State whilst doing it, making the Secretary of State even more embarrassed. He uses the dictator words to describe Xi Jinping just after he's had a press conference with him. I mean, the whole thing is an utter car crash. So let's just guess for a moment that, there's all these people in the administration who are coming along to the president and saying to him, well, we need to have a better relationship with the Chinese. How can the president assume control of the government and actually force that policy, even if he agreed with it? And on the basis of what we saw yesterday, I doubt that he does, by the way. My sense is that his feelings about China remain as viscerally hostile as always. But, even if that was his policy, how is he capable of enforcing the policy on the administration? One gets the sense that he's not ultimately the person who's making the big decisions. And he's certainly not the person who's capable of enforcing the decisions. The American system is based on the president taking an active control and supervising and running the government. If the president doesn't run the government, then nobody does. The Secretary of State can't act in his place. The National Security Advisor can't act in his place. Even if they tried to, other parts of the bureaucracy would be fully justified in saying, we're not going to listen to what you say because you have no authority to give us orders. So we see that even and as at the same time as the president comes along, tells Xi Jinping, according to the Chinese readout, well, about Taiwan, we're not going to support Taiwanese independence. We're not looking to create problems with you over Taiwan. We know that other parts of the government are now working hard to get a $10 billion arms package to Taiwan. And that is exactly what is going to enrage the Chinese. And Xi Jinping himself actually said to Biden, according to the Chinese readout, that arms deliveries to Taiwan are for the Chinese a red line, and that Taiwan remains for China the most sensitive issue. So even if the president, against his own instincts, were to agree that détente with China at the present time was the most important thing, one has to doubt, based on what we saw yesterday, that he would be in a position to enforce that against the other people in his government, the hardliners in his government that want to pursue further escalation.
Yeah, the whole thing is dysfunctional. And the Chinese saw that. They realized that. I wouldn't be surprised if another reason they decided to actually take this meeting, Xi Jinping actually traveling to the U.S., is because he wanted to see it firsthand for himself. I would not be surprised if they also said, these guys have lost complete control of everything. Let's just go see how bad it really is. I would not be surprised if that's a part of it as well. And they probably left that meeting just shaking their heads going, yeah, it's worse than we thought. They probably said it's worse than we thought. And I think that's just on a final note. I think that's the problem, is that what you said is Biden doesn't have control of the government. That's obvious. I mean, everyone knows that. But the question comes up, who does? It's the same thing that we saw with Ukraine. I put out a tweet the other day before this meeting took place, and I said, Putin and Biden, they had a meeting in June 2021, a summit meeting in Geneva. The talks went well, but there were differences. That was the conclusion. Then they had a virtual meeting in December 2021. And then we had the conflict in February 2022. So I mean, we've been down this road before. Yes. And the question arises, there's a part of the administration that wants to have these meetings and these talks, that wants to try and open up some dialogue, even if they are getting pressured from the business community. Okay, but then there's another part of the administration that wants to send money to Taiwan, and there's another part of the administration that wants to create trouble in the Asia Pacific, and there's another part of the administration that wants to give money to the military industrial complex. I mean, the whole thing is just so freaking dysfunctional. And even people like Blinken, even people like Blinken who are at the meeting, he's trying to manage Biden so that things don't go off the deep end. But if there's going to be escalation with China, he's going to be the first person to get on CNN and say, yes, Xi Jinping is a dictator. He's done it before. So I mean, even the people in attendance are talking out of both sides of their mouths. They don't have any clear position.
You're absolutely right in everything you said. Now, bear in mind, the entire world, every country in the world, every government in the world has seen those pictures of the president. They've watched the press conference. What the president of the United States does in a press conference is followed and watched by everybody. The Russians will have watched it. The Chinese obviously have, but everybody, the North Koreans, the Syrians, the Saudis, the Indians, everybody is going to be tracking and observing this. And of course, it gets even worse because, of course, the Chinese are going to go back to Beijing. Xi Jinping is going to go back to Beijing. He's going to brief the Politburo there. And the Chinese are going to share their impressions of this meeting with their great friends, who are, of course, the Russians. Now, you're absolutely correct. The whole thing is now completely dysfunctional. You talked about those disastrous meetings that took place in 2021, the one in June 2021 and the one in December 2021 between Putin and Biden. Those meetings ended up making the relationship worse because the Russians, who sensed that a crisis was coming, looked to get reach some kind of understanding with the president. And they had these encounters with the president, and they seemed to come away with the impression from both of those meetings that some kind of an understanding was reached, and they saw the policy then move in the opposite direction. And that undoubtedly soured the relationship between the Americans and the Russians even further. It's worse now. And I'm going to say something else. I think this summit meeting in San Francisco is going to ultimately lead to a further deterioration of relations with China. I think this is a thing people need to understand, because the Chinese, having met Biden, having explained things to Biden, having discussed everything with Blinken, will have come to the conclusion that the administration is incapable of pursuing a policy of détente and rapprochement with them. So they're going to intensify from this point onwards the steps they're going to be taking to secure their own position, to build up their forces, to make the proper trade relationships, especially with the Russians, to make sure that they get the necessary raw materials and food supplies in case there's a major crisis over Taiwan. But let's talk about Ukraine as well. There's been no contacts between Biden and Putin since the conflict, the military side of the conflict began in February 2022. And I think we can now see why, because the Russians aren't particularly keen, have shown no real desire at the moment to talk to Biden. But how does the administration set up a meeting between Biden and Putin at this time? How do they get Biden to telephone Putin to talk about the problems in Ukraine? I mean, the risks of doing that, of exposing Biden to a summit meeting or even a prolonged conversation with Putin, especially when there's a conflict like the one we're seeing underway, the risks are simply enormous. And there are various parts of the US bureaucracy, some of them, are bound to oppose it anyway. And if Biden cannot speak to Putin, what other Western leaders are able to, given that Biden can't come to an agreement with Putin, and given that it is the United States that has been driving this whole thing right from the outset? Any French or Italian or, heaven help us, German leader that tries to communicate at this time with Putin and tries to reach an understanding with him, assuming that they even wanted to do that, knows perfectly well that they risk having the rug pulled underneath them by the United States, because they can talk to Biden, they can reach some kind of understanding, as they think, with Biden, but they have no certainty that that understanding will stick. So we have total paralysis in diplomacy. We've been talking about the paralysis in US diplomacy that has been the hallmark of this administration. We now see an important reason why that is so.
Yeah. How dumb are the European Union leaders who...
And is the US stumbling into unnecessary conflicts in the Middle East? All right, we've got all these Iranian proxies who are attacking US bases. Like, who knew, that we have bases in Syria, right, against Syria's will, right? It's crazy. I mean, how would you feel like if China or Russia had military bases in the United States?
To get into place.
Yes.
And then I imagine we could be heading into a situation where there's another attack on a US base in Iraq or Syria, and that would be the trigger to set everything off.
We are dangerously close to that point, and we're getting ever closer to that point. Let me say this again. Even if a political decision to attack Iran has not yet been made, even if there's argument and dissension about this within the administration, which there may be, even if we assume that someone like, let's say, Blinken is opposed to this, which he might be. I mean, he's been going around the Middle East, he's been getting doors slammed in his face there. He probably has a better sense of the strength of Arab opinion than other people in Washington do. The mere presence of these military assets in the Middle East, poised to attack Iran, means that the temptation to use them to attack Iran is going to grow. And the pressure, therefore, from the people who have always wanted to attack Iran is going to increase also. And it's going to increase even more as the situation in Gaza itself looks increasingly as if it.
Why are there U.S. military bases in Syria? I think they're justified on the basis we need them to fight ISIS, or we need them to protect the Syrian people from the Syrian government. But it's just crazy to me that we have military bases in Syria, and it's only because Syria is racked by a civil war and doesn't have a strong government that we can pull this off. But you're just engendering so much unnecessary hatred and outrage by people in the Middle East against America for our overly intrusive actions in the Middle East.
It is becoming bogged down.
So why doesn't Iran, if you are to believe what the U.S. is saying, and these groups are run by Iran, they're controlled by the Iran state, why doesn't Iran just tell these groups, look, we understand that you want to attack these U.S. bases which illegally occupy Syria and that are present in Iraq, but for the time being, because things are so tense, don't launch any attacks on these illegal U.S. bases.
I think that is exactly.
Or maybe they don't. Or maybe they don't control. Or maybe they don't control these militias. I mean, once again, if we are to believe what the U.S. is saying, that's why I'm asking. That's why I said if we are to believe what the U.S. is saying. Yeah.
Well, I think you to a great extent answered the question, because of course the U.S. and Israel act as if these militias are pure Iranian proxies. That the Iranian intelligence agencies, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, has tight control over these militias. It's important to remember, however, that they are militias. They are not part of any regular army. That is also true, by the way, of Hezbollah itself. And it is a fundamental misconception to think that these militias have the same kind of discipline that, say, a irregular military force has. And I have no doubt at all that the Iranian government is not looking for the moment for a war with the United States. And they've been sending their people to Beirut, to Baghdad, to eastern Syria. They've been talking with these militia people there. All the evidence is that this is indeed what they're doing. And they're telling them, cool down, keep disciplined, don't begin this fight. And we had that speech on Saturday last weekend, from Hassan Nasrallah, who is the head of the Lebanese Hezbollah, by far the most powerful. And he said, look, Iran wasn't involved in what happened on the 7th of October and wasn't consulted. We weren't consulted and we weren't involved. We are not looking to fight. But he keeps trying, in other words, to exert discipline on his own fighters and on his own people. But of course, discipline like that is difficult to maintain. And when fighting between militias in this very tense and fraught international atmosphere in the Middle East begins, it may be very, very difficult for Iran itself to control its own allies and to exert the kind of discipline over them that the United States is demanding that it should. There is another factor, which is...
Right. Proxies are not clones, right? Proxies have some autonomy, right? They have some agency, right? This is the Council on Foreign Relations, a scholar from there, talking about why the U.S. has sent so many military resources, including 2 aircraft carriers to the Mediterranean and a nuclear power submarine to the Middle East.
For U.S. forces to fight alongside the Israelis, they were clearly intended to send a message to Israel's other adversaries in the region that any steps taken to widen the conflict beyond Israel and the Gaza Strip would be met with a resounding American response. And that message was specifically directed at Hezbollah, this Lebanese organization that's been around since the early 1980s, which is, part of what's called the axis of resistance, of which Hamas is part of, and to the Iranians, which is sort of the patron of the axis of resistance. And there was clearly an effort to send the message that widening the conflict is not in either Hezbollah or Iran's effort.
Okay, so what is the axis of resistance?
Yeah, I threw that out there. So Iran's overall goal is to drive the United States out of the Middle East. And one of the ways in which they try to do this is through proxy groups like Lebanon's Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Houthis in Yemen, and of course Hamas. Now, all of these groups are kind of under the umbrella of the axis of resistance, but they have, varying degrees of autonomy. And so through these proxies, Iran has the ability to sow chaos in and around the borders of America's partners in the region. And Hamas has specific nationalist goals and other goals that align with Iran's goals as well, which is, quite frankly, the destruction of Israel.
So just to circle back to where we are. it makes sense that we want to make sure this war doesn't spread to all these other places. But just so I fully understand, our aircraft carriers and the rest, they're not boots on the ground. They're not doing any shooting at all. They're just sort of floating there intimidatingly, telling everyone to sort of stay chill.
Right. I mean, if you've ever been up near a modern American warship, they are.
It is not chill.
It is definitely an intimidating sight. I mean, American warships have shot down missiles that the Houthis in Yemen have fired in Israel's direction. And that's the point. I think in addition to deterrence, the idea is to provide assistance should the Israelis need it in terms of missile defense. So, Israel has very sophisticated layers of missile defense. The Iron Dome system, which people have heard about, was an Israeli project that the United States joined in 2012. But if the war were to widen and to include Hezbollah, they have reportedly in excess of 100,000, some estimate as much as 150,000 rockets that can hit Israel. Under those circumstances, Israel's defense systems would be at best taxed and at worst not likely to be able to keep up with the rate of fire from Lebanon. And so the United States, those ships in the region would be a backstop for Israel's own defenses. And I suspect, because there are reports that President Biden took the unusual step of communicating directly with the Iranian leadership, that he warned them in the event that the war is widened, the United States will respond in a resounding kind of way, which raises the stakes in this conflict for Americans. We also sent senior military.
Okay, so this is kind of a centrist perspective here.
Military officers to Israel to talk to them about American experiences in Iraq, in trying to root out the Islamic State in both Iraq and Syria, and the challenges that represents, because the Gaza Strip, 25 miles long, 6 miles wide, is a very, very built-up area, and that Hamas is...
Right, so this is kind of an establishment centrist perspective. This is from the Council on Foreign Relations, right? The Duran, not part of the establishment. And let's get back to Alexander Mercouris from the Duran podcast talking about U.S. military fighting with militias in the Middle East.
Of course, Iran itself, as we also know, is not a political monolith. I get the sense that, the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, is not looking for a conflict with the United States. The Iranian government, led by Ebrahim Raisi, is not looking for a conflict with the United States. But that doesn't mean that everybody in Iran, within the leadership and political structures, might share those views, might necessarily shares those views. There may be some people, in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, for example, that, are also furious about what's going on in Gaza, furious about this build-up by US forces, still burning to avenge the assassination some years ago of their chief, General Soleimani, and they might actually be looking for a fight with the United States. So, the Iranian government, itself may want to avoid a war, but that doesn't mean it is able to control the situation.
Right. So the best thing they can do is prepare.
Yeah, and I'm sure that's what they're doing. And of course, the trouble is, it works on the other side. Obviously, Iran doesn't have the scale of military assets that the United States does. But of course, the more they prepare, the more, again, the risk of escalation increases, because, the US will see all these forces, they will see the missiles being moved to their bases. We know that this is happening. They will see all of those steps being taken, and that will increase pressure in Washington from people there. They will say, look, the Iranians are taking all of these steps. That means that they have some aggressive intention, and they're also attacking our people across the Middle East. So let's retaliate, and let's retaliate hard before the Iranians get their blowing. So it's an incredibly dangerous situation, and one which, I think the Iranian government does have some control over it. But, within Washington at the moment, I'm not sure that anybody does. And that's an even more dangerous situation than everything else we've been talking about.
Well, the neocons in the U.S. are definitely saying strike first. Tim Scott in the debates the other day, the GOP debates, I think he said cut off the snake cut off the head of the snake, meaning Iran, and strike first now. That was what Tim Scott said. So I mean, the neocon thinking right now is dominated by this strike first at Iran mentality. Anyway, okay, so that's the World War III angle. Let's talk about what's happening in the war in Gaza, in Israel. Well, what's happening there?
It's essential to understand that these two things are connected with each other. I mean, the reason people like Tim Scott, and of course he's Republican, but of course the neocons are present in both parties, and they're neocons first and foremost before they are Republicans or Democrats. Let's always remember that. So the reason they are so in such a strong position at the moment, in such a pole position, is because there is already a conflict in the Middle East, an armed conflict in the Middle East, in which the US is intimately involved, and that of course is the conflict in Gaza. And one gets the sense, this is a difficult conflict to read because, again, we get very controlled information from each side. But one gets the sense, again, that this isn't going particularly well. General Scott, the new chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States, he stopped over in Tokyo on Thursday, and he was interviewed there by reporters, and he said that what the Israelis are trying to do to destroy Hamas in Gaza is a very tall order. So he didn't seem to think that it would be an easy thing to do. In fact, my own impression, reading his words, is that he didn't think it was an achievable thing to do. And apparently, again, the Israelis are suffering losses, not huge losses, but real losses in both men and equipment. And I get the sense also that though they managed to, encircle Gaza City by moving along the main roads, they've not really so far taken the battle to where Hamas is strongest in its own strongholds, which is, of course, in the urban areas. And meanwhile, the fighting there continues, or rather the bombing has continued. But what we now see is that the political pressure to ease off is growing. And we now have these humanitarian pauses, which are supposed to happen every day. I mean, partly the intention is to try to get people out of northern Gaza into southern Gaza. It's not clear to what extent that is actually happening. But when there are humanitarian pauses, the pressure to extend them into a permanent ceasefire is inevitably going to grow. And there are reports of increasing dissension within the administration, within the US government, within the State Department, within even the White House. White House aides are unhappy. People within the Democratic Party are unhappy. They're looking at the situation in Michigan and other states like that, where there's large Arab communities that are key in tightly fought elections. And you can sense that both Biden and Netanyahu are feeling the pressure, because both of them have again had to come out and say that for the moment they're opposing a ceasefire, even though, as I said, the pressure is growing all the time. And can I just say, it's not just political pressure in Israel and in the United States and in the Middle East. It's political pressure in all the European countries. There is now a major political crisis which has just stirred up in Britain, in which the Home Secretary, the person in charge of the police forces, ultimately is now in conflict. That's the person called.
Okay, I want to get a buzz from John Mearsheimer. He was just speaking at Judge Napolitano's show.
Other scholars of the Holocaust are worried about genocidal intent. But again, intent is different from actually committing genocide.
But in a world where international law is essentially unenforced or selectively enforced against those who manage to get caught, does it matter if we're talking about war crimes or genocide? We're talking about the slaughter of innocents, civilians.
Well, I think it does matter, because I think genocide is a far worse crime than massacring civilians. I don't want to make light of massacring civilians, and it almost sounds like I'm doing that, but I don't want to make light of it. I don't want to make light of what the Israelis are doing in Gaza. I think it's absolutely horrible, but I don't think it's a genocide at this point in time. I think there is potential for genocide, and I think you have to be very careful here. And that's why I think that people who study the Holocaust, which was clearly a genocide, understand that we're out on the slippery slope here, or the Israelis are out on the slippery slope. Of course, Joe Biden is backing them to the hilt, and this is why people are spray painting words like Genocide Joe outside the White House. And he should be aware of what's going on, and he should go to great lengths to make sure we don't slide down that slope.
Here's President Vladimir Putin of Russia at a BRICS conference yesterday with his views on all this.
We call for joint efforts of the international community aimed at de-escalating the situation, a ceasefire, and finding a political solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And the BRICS states and countries of the region could play a key role in this work.
Why is he jumping in on this, Professor Mearsheimer?
It makes eminently good sense diplomatically. He looks like a good guy to the vast majority of people on the planet. We're the ones who look like the bad guys. Both Putin and Xi Jinping understand that blaming the United States for this mess, for causing this mess, and then for not holding back the Israelis and indeed supporting the Israelis, damages America's diplomatic position in the world and provides an opportunity for them to enhance Russia and China's diplomatic position.
For all the people that the innocent civilians that the IDF is killing, have they really even made a dent so far into Hamas soldiers, whatever they call themselves, Hamas killers, whatever you want to call them?
I think fighters is a good word.
Okay, fighters, we'll use that word.
Well, I've been thinking hard about this over the past week. I mean, we're 6 weeks into this campaign, and I think the conventional wisdom is that the Israelis are doing quite well, and they're eventually going to solve the problem that they face. I think if you look carefully at the reports in the mainstream media in the United States, this is not true. The Wall Street Journal just had a big piece that said that out of the 30,000 Hamas fighters in Gaza, the Israelis have killed 1,000. Think about that. They've killed 1,000 out of 30,000 after 6 weeks. That's a very small number. Furthermore, it's quite clear that they have not destroyed the tunnel network. This is not to say they haven't destroyed a few tunnels and sealed some openings to some of the tunnels, but there's no evidence they've systematically torn apart the tunnels in northern Gaza. And furthermore, they haven't found any of the people who were captured by Hamas. And that was, a total of 240 people. They haven't found any of them. And the Wall Street Journal was reporting that the Israelis are now getting ready to head down into the southern part of Gaza to deal with Hamas down there. And you say to yourself, well, they've only killed 1,000 out of 30,000 fighters up in the north. And you would assume they started in the north because that was the main area where Hamas was located. And now they're going down into the south. And the journal reports that the IDF believes that going south is going to be even more difficult than the operation in the north. And then you start saying to yourself, what are they going to do? Are they going to bomb southern Gaza the way they bombed northern Gaza? Remember, they forced all of those civilians in northern Gaza to move to southern Gaza. So there are a huge number of civilians in southern Gaza. What are they going to do? Launch another punishment campaign? I don't think they can get away with that. And if they do, it will be an act of war that really ends up killing massive numbers of civilians. So I think the Israelis are actually between a rock and a hard place here. I don't think they're in good shape in Gaza. And we haven't even touched on the situation inside of Israel. You want to remember, there are 200,000 displaced people inside of Israel. These are 200,000 Israelis, some from the Lebanon border where Hezbollah is launching attacks, and some from southern Israel, where there's the problem involving Gaza. So a lot of displaced people. They've mobilized 350,000 troops.
And Luke Croft says in the chat, if Israel can't get Egypt to open the border, how can Israelis successfully ethnically cleanse the Palestinians out of Gaza? And the answer is they cannot.
This has to be hurting the economy big time. So I think the Israelis are in a quite bad situation at this point in time, contrary to what is the conventional wisdom.
How many deaths are too many deaths?
Well, I mean, the normal answer to that would be one death. But I mean, the numbers here are really very high. You're starving them, and you're preventing humanitarian aid from
companies and others in southern Gaza to service the large numbers of people that have been chased down there by the bombardment up north.
I understand there was an attack against a field hospital. Yeah. Who carried it out? What happened?
Okay, we have a hospital, a military hospital south of Gaza City, and now we're going to have a second one in the south of Gaza. Now, the one that was struck was, there's a mosque next to the hospital, and the Israeli military bombarded that mosque, and people were running because they were injured, running to the hospital. And as our military people came out to help them, they got also hit. So we had 7 injured, and now they're okay. They've been taken care of. But we do not find it normal that all the hospitals are attacked. We do not find it normal that we're attacking civilians and a collective punishment. This cannot go on, Margaret. This cannot go on.
She makes a very compelling argument, Professor Mearsheimer.
It's impossible to disagree with.
Can it go on? All right. As long as Israel feels that its existence is at stake, is threatened by a militarized Hamas, it will go on, right? When a nation feels that it's fighting for its very existence, it will go on and on and on.
They said was a hole in the ground underneath the hospital that apparently was an entrance to some tunnel, but they could not provide any evidence that this was a major military facility for Hamas. But anyway, if you believe that Hamas fighters are traveling in ambulances and Hamas fighters are locked up in hospitals or schools or mosques, then you can justify to yourself attacking those sites. So I think it's quite clear, and lots of people who are in Gaza are saying this, that there is no safe place. Any place you go, even places that are run by the United Nations, are liable to be attacked.
The Israeli economy is getting clobbered. There are 350,000 formerly productive middle-class workers, lawyers, physicians, school teachers who are now in the reservists and fighting or training to fight, so they're not producing. There are 200,000 displaced Israelis who don't have a place to live and don't have any income. And even the Palestinian laborers who had permission to leave Gaza and come into Israel and do manual labor obviously can't do any of that. How are Hamas's finances looking?
I would just also note to you, Judge, that Israel depends very heavily on tourism. And needless to say, given the circumstances in Israel today, there's not a lot of tourism. So the Israeli economy over the long term is in really bad shape. I mean, this war has been going on for 6 weeks. And as I said before, the Wall Street Journal reports that they've only killed 1,000 out of 30,000 fighters. They still have to finish in the north. And then when they're done in the north, they're going to move to the south. This war is going to go on for a long time. And the economic problems that you described now are just going to grow exponentially over time, one would think. Now, turning to Hamas's finances, right? The Economist has a big story that says Hamas is doing very well in terms of its finances. And if anything, the situation is likely to improve. It's quite clear if you look at the Economist article that the center of that financial empire that you see mentioned in the headline is in Istanbul. And the Turks, in particular, President Erdogan, are very sympathetic to Hamas. And it's quite clear that the Turks are helping Hamas with its finances. And to be honest, the article makes it clear that Hamas doesn't even need much help. It's a very sophisticated operation at the financial level. And as you can tell, if the key financial people are located in Istanbul, it's very hard for the Israelis and for the Americans to do much to shut down Hamas's finances. So in terms of the economic dimension of this war, I think Hamas is doing much better than Israel is doing.
Professor John Mearsheimer, on the late in the afternoon and the day before Thanksgiving, thank you for your insight. and thank you for your time.
Okay, that's it for me for now.